Good afternoon, everybody. My name is David Duffy, the Chief Executive of the Governance Company, and I'm joined by Bob Semple, who is probably one of the best innovators in corporate governance in Ireland, even if I say so myself. So we're delighted to welcome you here to what I think will be a revealing piece of research on how you can think about making board meetings better. And we've titled this research we've done, Time for a Fresh Approach, which we'll speak about a bit later. So Bob.
Thanks, David. And just to say a big hello to everyone, and thank you all for taking the time, and for all of those who completed the survey as well. We've got some really interesting findings here. My background is, as David said, I'm a governance and risk guy, formerly with PwC, and for the last 7 years, an independent director and consultant on governance and risk. We thought we'd start, everybody, just with a simple question. And this is really to remind ourselves about the fact that actually, amidst all the technology, there are lots of people involved. So we've a poll that we'd like you to complete very, very quickly. What is your energy level right now? So just click on 1 to 10, and we'll take a look and see how we're doing as a group, and we'll come back to that in a moment. So just take 20 seconds. Let's see how we're doing. We're up to about 65. Just give another, say, 10 seconds to let people finish polling. Excellent. So we're just about there. So David, over to you.
Okay, thanks everybody for that. So moving on. So the background to the survey was in March, as some of you might know, I do a lot of board evaluations and help fix governance issues. I thought boards might be facing a real challenge going forward in terms of how they're going to cope with COVID. I didn't think for quite so long, but there will be quite so long going forward. So we carried out quite a very detailed piece of research, and over 130 organizations completed it. About 80% of those were in Ireland, and another 20% were overseas in 10 different countries. So what we put together here is based on that. And then as part of this process, myself and Bob got together, because he has great insight into this, because he kind of works in the same places. We decided to put our both joint resources together to see if we could make the value in what we produce better today. So what we're going to present today actually is a combination of the research and a lot of insightful thinking we've done over the last 3 or 4 months.
So our first port of call then is to take a look at our agenda for today. Oh, sorry, Dave, you were just going to comment actually on some of the key concerns coming out of the survey.
Yeah, so, whoops. So the concerns coming out of the survey were to do with engagement, flow, and just trying to understand how board meetings might work in a different environment. In an old environment, people didn't think about the engagement thing, which is, you know, a lot of us are connected, but actually very disconnected at the moment because we're not seeing that many people on a regular basis. So those are some of the things that came out of it. We're going to expand on these things going forward. So what we'd like to talk about, whoops, sorry, over the next little while is the whole concept of user experience, which Bob's going to talk about. And in particular, what we've created is a thing called the virtual meeting maturity model. And I think hopefully at the end of this presentation, you'll be able to assess based on the 10 questions we were going to put to you where your organization is on that. I think you'll find that very helpful to figure out where your starting point is in developing your own approach to making better board meetings. So Bob.
So let's just take a quick look at the poll results looking at energy levels, and they're ranging from 2 to, do we get up to a 10? We do. So there's at least one person buzzing on the call, which is great, but a range of other energy levels. And this is the reason why I was so interested in thinking about applying the user experience discipline to the boardroom. A lot of us are useful, especially if we're familiar with the retail sector, with the B2C space. We talk about the customer journey, and we talk about the experience, and in marketing terms, we talk about how many different personas have we defined and how are we controlling all of that. But have we stopped and asked the question, how do we get on in the boardroom itself? And the question I suppose that I'd ask all of us is, how many times do we come out of a board meeting feeling like this lady, energized, full of beans, a fantastic result, a real pleasure to come along to the board meeting. Or going back to the wildcat that David showed a few moments ago, how often do we come out feeling absolutely drained and exhausted? I was chatting to somebody the other day who had been at a 7-hour virtual board meeting, and they only had the break at lunchtime. They went solidly through the morning, had a break, and solidly through the afternoon. And how they weren't taken off in white coats is anyone's guess. So what we wanted to look at then was, how could we heighten or enhance the experience of each individual board member? And that's what led us then to thinking about, well, what are the elements that we need to incorporate in thinking about the successive levels of maturity of a board meeting. And that's what led us, in fact, to the maturity model idea. David.
Yeah, so many of us have been at board meetings and you come out drained, but actually I think a board meeting should be an opportunity for inspiration. You know, a good chair, good leadership, good values, because an executive wants to come out of a board meeting feeling energized about, God, we really got that value out of that board meeting. And many times, I don't know if you've been on executive teams, you come out feeling, God, I'm not looking forward to the next one after that experience. So we've kind of bottled our thinking here into what we call the maturity model. And there's kind of 4 stages to it. The first stage is getting the meeting basics right. And myself and Bob do a lot of board evaluations, and a lot of organizations struggle to get this right. The next bit is the technology. And, you know, Bob will demonstrate later on, there is no end to new technology that can be helpful in the boardroom. And he'll talk about that. And then how do you blend the basics with the technology to adapt to virtual? That in itself is another big leap one needs to make. And then what is best practice? Well, probably most boards won't get there because this is evolving all the time. But the thing is to try and start and go along that curve. So what is level 1? Meeting basics. Meeting basics is making sure that you have absolute clarity on what you want to get out of each meeting. What are the outcomes you are seeking? And that should help inform the agenda. You know, whether you have items for information, discussion, or decision. I was at a board meeting a number of months ago. A decision was required for 400 grand investment. That wasn't even down as a decision on the board meetings. I was a non-exec director. This was news to me. And that caused issues in the boardroom. Meeting basics is about getting the timing and the agenda right. And in virtual times, you've got to say, well, we have a maximum here maybe of 2 hours or 2.5 hours. How do we make best use of that time? How do we time the agenda so the chair can actually control the agenda? And it's not up to the loudest voice in the room as to how much time is spent on each of the items. So, oops. The other things we talked about there was making sure the priority items on the agenda were the top, and making sure that other opportunities for doing some collaboration outside the board meeting before it starts, and we're going to come back to that later. So what we want to do now is a little brainstorm, and this to get you engaged and get you a sense of what it likes to be, what it's like to be collaborating online. And we have a group here of 115 people, which is fantastic. So I'm going to put you into breakout rooms. The question you have to answer is, what 3 words would you use to describe the most successful board meeting you've been at? And we want you to put that into chat. And we're going to give you 5 minutes to think about that. You're going to be randomly selected going into each of the breakout rooms. I don't know who's going to be with who. Hopefully it works out okay for each of you. Whoops.
So most everyone has heard of the film Eat, Pray, Love. We're looking for the 3 equivalent words for the most successful board meeting. That's your task for over the next 5 minutes. Looking forward to seeing what you have to suggest.
Okay, so we're just going through allocating you very carefully on a random basis to lots of breakout rooms. So here we go. Bang, you have 5 minutes and we bring you back. Okay.
All disappearing away. David, it might be an idea just to send around a broadcast message reminding people to turn on their video.
Oh, yeah.
The breakout rooms. Just a reminder, folks, you have to click on the link to join the breakout room. So please do that to join your breakout room. So all these faces should disappear for us, David, on the screen here. David, in case a few people came in late, you might like to manually add those people to breakout rooms on a random basis.
Okay. Yeah, it's not clear to me how to do that.
Okie dokie. Well, maybe we might just have a chat here among the people who are not allocated. So if you'd like to chip in, unmute yourself and let's have a little chat about what 3 keywords would the people who are remaining here who aren't in breakout rooms like to suggest. So first come, first serve. Anyone like to kick off the chat?
Bob, I think in the main session, I haven't allowed people to unmute themselves. So I think a good option would be to use the chat box.
Okay, fine. Yep. Yep. Let's then ask you to put in keywords. If you've a set of 3, you won't have the advantage of having been able to chat with other people, but just for yourself, what would be the sorts of words that spring to mind for a really successful board meeting? So, you know, to get you thinking, perhaps something that strikes me is direct, oversee, deliver, which speaks to the heart of what good governance is, but puts the emphasis on impact about delivering. But you may have some other ideas. So we're getting our first ideas in there. Thank you, Katrina. Being prepared and being engaged. Yeah. Who else has some ideas? Just enter them into the chat box there. We have a bunch of quiet types here, David, obviously.
Yes. So we've had 4 minutes.
So do you want to send around that broadcast message?
Yeah.
Just do the breakout.
Yep.
You know, just while we're waiting there, if I can elaborate on, you mentioned quickly this idea of for information, for discussion, or for approval. And in one particular case, I suggested the introduction of that discipline along with a summary paper for every board paper, summary sheet. And a while later, the company secretary called me and said, Bob, why don't you come around? I need to talk to you a bit about the implementation of your recommendations. So I duly did. I wasn't sure what was on the agenda, but anyway, the company secretary told me, look, here's the folder that I put together using this regime. And do you know what effect it had? I said, no, tell me, quick. And she said, well, the meeting took half the time usually. Instead of 4 hours, it took 2. And the board members came out of it about twice as happy as they usually were, because it brought a level of focus and attention to exactly what was the ask of the board, which the board could then respond to and either make their decision or make suggestions for alternative work. So we're a really simple, practical technique, but one which has very, very handsome dividends if it's done properly.
Okay, so we'll close in 10 seconds and then we'll have a flood of individuals back.
Yeah. So we're not getting many suggestions in the chat box yet, unless I'm not bang up to date. Do you want to give people 10 seconds to put in a few keywords there just to see what the thoughts were?
Okay.
All right, clarity is clarity and honesty. Great, valued. Good sharing we're certainly going to talk about. Timely decisions, excellent, yeah.
Lots of stuff now.
Yeah, a bit of fun, imagine. Yeah, I'm all for the human element in all of this. Productive and focused, energized, enthusiastic, tone from the top, you know, the board really leading from the front foot, if you like, proper preparation. AOB at the start of the meeting so that the timing can be rejigged, interesting one. Engaged, inspired, and challenged, like that one. Engaging and energized, that's coming up a few times. Sharing, interesting, is coming up quite a number of times, and I'll certainly share some comments on that later on. There's the, what do we need from each agenda item? Great. And inspirational, the literal meaning of the word being to breathe life into. Do we really inspire our executive and the rest of the organization? Yeah, positively. Super, so excellent suggestions there.
Okay, so
let's see what the survey told us, David.
So moving on, hopefully that was helpful for everybody there. So I'll get rid of this thing here. Oops. So this is what the survey said. Probably no surprises here for some of it. Video better than audio. Who wants to look at a blank screen when somebody's there, maybe having a cup of coffee when they should be engaged in a board meeting? An agenda focus on priority items, which makes absolute sense. Better quality board papers, absolutely. And the chair enforces ground rules. Now, we don't know where these people are starting from as to what they think good board papers are, or what good ground rules are, or what are priority items. So we don't have that sense of where we're starting from. But what was really interesting that, you know, over half disagreed that they're getting feedback at the end of the meeting. One of the critical things is in running virtual meetings is, how are they going? So if you're running a board meeting physically, you can probably, you know, well, you'll see people face to face and you see how they are, and you'll see if they're in good form. You might see if they're a bit grumpy. You might see if they're disengaged. You might see if they're engaged. That's much more difficult on a virtual board meeting, because you're looking at a tiny little screen for maybe, you know, 12 or 15 people the outside, hopefully. So actually understanding how people are within the meeting is important. We're living in difficult times, so people may be very different from where they are now versus where they might have been 6 months ago, because they have a host of other issues. You know, if they're working from home, the wife is working from home, they might have kids going to school, so the pressures actually are much greater. And a good chair will seek to engage with these people to make sure that he or she it really knows where the mental health is at. It's not just the business, the mental health. So part and parcel of getting this feedback, which we're going to talk about later, is critical to that.
Okay, so David's covered the meeting basics. Let's talk about technology for a while. And my key question here is tech. What tech? And the reason I ask that question is because if we as board members get distracted for 1 second by muting or unmuting or the screen being in the wrong place or whatever, that is taking our attention away from what is the core business of the meeting, to actually discharge our duties as board members, as directors. And so getting the tech really well set up becomes absolutely critical. What are the things that are allowed? First of all, a legal note to make sure that your constitution permits online meetings, because some constitutions don't. And that's something which hopefully at this stage everyone has figured out. Then figuring out from the plethora of different technologies out there, what's the set of technology that works for you and for your board? And that's a non-trivial task, and you're going to need some help with that. My experience certainly is that some chairs and some company secretaries are really very, very good on the tech and make it all look very, very simple and smooth. And then in other cases, they find it a lot more challenging. So getting the right tech solution is really, really important. And that's right down to the quality of Wi-Fi. It's down to the microphone. It's down to where is the camera in relation to you. The temptation is, if you're using an iPhone or maybe even a laptop, that it's coming at you from underneath, and there's an excellent view up both nostrils, which is not always the most inspiring for everyone else on the board. So trying to get the eye line straight in line with the camera, and typically what I do is I put my camera on top of the screen. And another small thing, which really I've only cottoned on to quite recently, and you can see it there, very fancy looking microphone. This is a condenser microphone, which gives a full range of frequencies. So it's not that strangulated, tinny voice that you sometimes hear with poor quality microphones. Hopefully the sound is coming across as rather rich and full and natural. So those are all the disciplines. In practice, what do we find? What did the survey actually tell us? So let's take a look. Well, the challenges certainly were there on the tech and on getting a secure space and adequate Wi-Fi. And look at the percentages. You know, just getting the tech, that's 1 in 3 expressing concerns. And then a secure space, just a place to actually be, to participate without noise, without being overheard, without interruption, all of those things, and adequate Wi-Fi. And there are lots of funny moments when people get frozen in a particularly funny expression, but it doesn't necessarily lend that much to a very effective board meeting. And specifically then on the use of headphones to cut out extraneous noise, or particularly on proper use of the microphone and the camera. So as many as 1 in 4 were critical about colleagues' use of the microphone and camera. I can't hear you, I can't see you, you're only seeing from the nose up, or a whole host of other reasons. Getting these things right makes a big, big difference. And having the people around the table who are comfortable with it makes the difference. Even more so, having the chair and the COSEC being really on top of the technology makes an enormous difference. I'm part of a group of facilitators internationally, and it was really interesting. One of the group recently, who is from the broadcast industry, was talking about production values and saying, you know, when we're running a virtual board meeting, we need to think about production values in the same way that somebody running the Late Late Show on television, or whatever your favorite late night chat show, thinks about camera angles, thinks about quality of sound and so on. And that for really big meetings, interestingly, a lot of people are now assigning the task specifically to one individual to say, you control all of that stuff, the slides, the volume, who's muted, who's on, the polls, everything else, because there's a lot to do. So a lot of stuff in the tech basics, and clearly a lot of challenges. So let's put the two together. David, adapting to virtual.
Okay. So this is the big challenge. So we take the meeting basics and getting those right, and you can assess where your own boards are as appropriate. And based on what Bob has told us, I mean, how do you adapt to virtual? A very simple example I came across a couple of weeks ago was a board member who was struggling with Wi-Fi and video. And then another board member said, well, how many others in the house are feeding off that Wi-Fi at the moment? He said, oh, 3, my son and my wife. But he hadn't thought through the impact of that on having a quality audio and a quality video to the board meeting. So it's simple checkpoints like that. I was on another webinar on Tuesday night, and one of the board members was participating, but there was very patchy audio because there was a connection between her microphone and her computer wasn't quite right. So we had to say, well, perhaps just check that. So all these things need to be thought about. And a lot of it's just pure education. And as Bob said, you need somebody there to figure out how do we make sure that every board member has a good user experience. So you need to have somebody who understands that. And it probably won't be the tech guy in your organization. If you have a tech guy, you might have to bring somebody in to help that tech guy making sure there's a great user experience to board members so that it feels better and it doesn't feel like a chore having to go into a board meeting. Some of the findings we came across here, excuse me, what the people said, I don't know what's going on here. Here we go. Because the chair is virtual, he or she needs to have a much more formal approach to running the meeting. So having absolute clarity on the whole meeting setup, you know, has somebody checked out, do all the board members, are they familiar with the technology? Very simple. And we're all learning this, and you can see even from this today, you know, this isn't perfect, but it's probably one of the first presentations in the country on this particular issue. Another group said the voting procedures weren't clear. I was at a meeting last week and they were anything but clear that a decision was being making to me. Comfort breaks, you know, we've only got so much capacity each in terms of how long we might last sitting around your own chair at home, whatever it might be. But the big finding here was the interaction wasn't properly catered for. So adapting to virtual is having, I suppose, clarity on how you might interact within a board meeting. There's some technology, a little hand can go up, you can send something to the chat box, but chairing a board meeting means you have to sort of look out for all these things, and you might need somebody by your side to say, look, there's an email from somebody or there's something in the chat box to help you as the chair. The chair can't do everything. So what you find by even doing webinars like this, there's a lot of features that one needs to understand, and these same skills would feed into how you run a board meeting. So those are some of the things that we saw. So trying to adapt to virtual, it'll take time. And as we'll demonstrate later on here, there's no shortage of technology.
Maybe if I can just elaborate on one or two additional examples there, David, just before we move on to best practice. You recall earlier on in meeting basics that a very high percentage of respondents said, no, the chair was good at doing the ground rules, applying the ground rules in the virtual meeting. And yet, here's 78% of people saying that we need an even more formal approach to running meetings. And the key reason for that, I feel, if you link it to the last point about the interaction, is that it's a little bit more tricky to get that informal interaction going in a face-to-face meeting when you're on screen. So that means that the chair needs to think about some new tactics, and a very simple one which I've used in the past and seen it used to great effect is the round robin. So you say, look, we're on to item number 4 on the agenda. I'd like to get a sense of where board members are on this one. So I'm going to ask each board member to spend 30 to 60 seconds, that's all, with the top 1 or 2 points in response to this paper. And you quickly go around all of the board members, and then as the chair, you're able to say, well, look, it seems that the first part of the proposal seems to be getting pretty unanimous support, whereas in the second part, there are some issues to be discussed. So let's now, for example, use a breakout room and see, can we tease that out and find the areas of common interest? So it's thinking through those sorts of tactics, if you like, that can compensate for a less comfortable virtual world compared to the face-to-face that makes a big difference. The last point I just make on this is that Harvard did some research, particularly on the comfort breaks, and their recommendation is a break at least once every hour for probably 5 to 10 minutes. Take a break, stretch your legs, have a cup of tea, powder your nose, whatever. So those are some of the adaptations to the virtual. So let's now move on then to best practice. And this is where we're going from the honors course right up to sort of PhD level and looking for all of the emerging approaches that people are using in making for very effective virtual meetings. And it's interesting, you know, I don't know about you, David, but I find that the world is split a bit, that there are a number of directors who say, oh no, I really don't like virtual meetings, face-to-face is best, and you know, I want more of what we had before. And my encouragement to them is to say, you know, suspend disbelief for a moment and see what is now possible using different tactics and different approaches. So what did directors say here? Well, interestingly, the very first one was 89% said that face-to-face meetings were more effective. And that's an assertion that I really want to challenge. Not that based on the experience that people have, so I'm not doubting their experience of this, but what I am saying is that there are ways in which a virtual meeting can be even more effective than a face-to-face meeting. And I'm going to give a couple of examples of that. Now, respondents did say that they found engagement a lot more challenging. Is it waving frantically in the camera? Is it putting up the little icon which shows a hand up in the air? The things that David mentioned a moment ago. How do we get that free-flowing sort of conversation? And especially where one person says something which prompts you to interrupt and say, actually, that's a great point, Mary, and it reminds me of such and such. And how do you get that free-flowing conversation that leads to very effective, detailed, deep dive discussions and ultimately better decisions? That's a challenge that people recognized. And then the third one that I've picked out from this part of the survey was looking at the quality and timeliness of minutes. And I spoke to a board member recently who expressed a concern about how meetings were now happening with increasing frequency because they had to be scheduled in response to COVID challenges of one sort or another, whether it was staff welfare or important contracts or fundraising or whatever the case may be. But one of the things that crept into those meetings was this a formally convened board meeting, or was it a meeting of board members, which was just a briefing? And likewise, was it properly convened? Was there a proper minute? Were the proper papers presented for board members, rather than being surprised, as David described earlier, here's an approval for 400 grand, you know, please rubber stamp it. And for board members to actually say, no, hang on a second now, we haven't been notified about this. I need more detail before I'm prepared to give that my stamp of approval. And my argument is that I think we can do all of these things an awful lot better. And I have a couple of ideas that I want to run through quickly now. So the first really is on the question of our own awareness of ourselves, of our own styles, and of our own strengths. So this mandala, as it's called, this colorful diagram here, is used by one of the psychological evaluation tools called Lumina. And the question I have for you, if you were to put a tick mark against one of the 8 words that your phrases that you see on this mandala, which would be your greatest strength as a board member? Is it that you're terrifically discipline driven, or are you inspiration driven? Do you see that the big picture that is going to inspire everyone else? Are you really concentrated on getting the job done quickly, or are you very, very good with people, and so on? So an actual mandala, a completed mandala, looks something like this. And you can get your own one, by the way. If you go up on the App Store and look for Lumina, L-U-M-I-N-A, you can do a very high level splash and get a picture like this to see what your relative strengths are in each of these 8 areas. So this individual is showing from 2 o'clock to 6 o'clock, if you like, on the face of a clock, big picture thinking, extroverted, out there, demonstrative, getting engaged, outcome focused, wants to get the job done, and very discipline driven, but isn't showing the same sorts of strengths in being down to earth, in being introverted, and being that cautious, reflective person, a little spike into people focused, and not much in the inspiration driven. This in fact is my splash, just to share with you. And if you look at outcome focused, there are 3 qualities that come up with this, and they are, I just bring them up now, they are tough, competitive, and logical. And these are all meant to be strengths. So tough in that you're prepared to face into difficult decisions and have rigorous candor, respectful challenge. Competitive, that just because somebody says something else, you're prepared to argue the case, pros and cons. And logical, that you say, no, let's take the matter of opinion out of this. Let's get the facts. Let's get the statistics. Let's understand it properly. Now, all of these qualities, and there are corresponding qualities for each of the 8 segments of the mandala, can be overplayed. So if I rely too heavily on them, then there's a danger that they will turn into maladaptive qualities. So instead of just being tough, it might go to the point of seeking conflict. Instead of just competitive, I might be seen to be winning at all costs. And so the better I get to know my profile, the better I can interact with others, and the better I can understand their profiles to make for much more effective interaction. And certainly on 2 of the boards that I've been on, one in North America and one in France, in the last 2 or 3 years, we've had full psychological profiles done on every single board member, and in one case on all of the management team. And this is not a surprise. I know a number of you, especially those in the financial services space, will be very alert to this because of the central bank looking at the importance of culture and behavior and really going to town. One of my colleagues recently joined a pension board in Holland, and he had to do a full day of training laid down by the Dutch central bank on behaviors and culture, on all this sort of stuff, because of the concern about cognitive bias and about poorly framed decisions in practice. So this is one area where we can contribute to much better meetings by having a better understanding of ourselves and of others. And of course, it raises the question of collaboration. And the simple fact is, going back to meeting basics, that traditional meetings actually have quite a few problems. How many of us have seen these sorts of things in practice? And the 2 that concern me most are cognitive bias and defective decision-making. And that's at the heart of boards being really, really effective. The interesting thing about the electronic collaboration tools is that we can do it differently. So we're at the bottom diagram here, we're doing a same time, different place meeting, which is what our virtual meeting is. We can also do this other variation of a different time, different place. So in other words, if we wanted to collaborate for a week before the meeting and people could come in at different times and contribute their ideas, react to others, add their comments and so on, that would be an asynchronous meeting as opposed to a synchronous meeting. And that gives rise to a whole bunch of advantages. It means that we can be much more connected as a board. It can compensate for the fact that we're not shaking hands and having the chat over a coffee, making sure that every voice gets heard equally, that the points get considered, not the people making the points, and that the points being made are properly assessed for their intrinsic merits. That we can generate a whole lot more ideas, inputs, and contributions. It saves a whole bunch of time and so on. I won't go through all of them. Now, the next slide, just to give you a warning, is really, really busy. And I'm not asking you to read it now, but we will circulate the slides later so that it's available to you for reference. So on the left-hand side is a checklist from Harvard Business Review about how to make for really much smarter meeting design. And a lot of it you'll nod and say, yeah, that's pretty obvious. And yeah, we do all of that and so on. So this is meeting basics, if you like. But on the right-hand side, I've inserted a column that describes all of the benefits of using electronic collaboration tools to help execute the ideas on the left-hand side. And there are, as Dave mentioned earlier, there are an absolute plethora of tools available. And so here's a diagram which a colleague of mine put together. Each of the colored boxes or ovals gives you a category. So on the bottom left-hand side, there's video conferencing. We have Zoom and Join Me and Skype and all those ones. And then top right, we have decision support and meeting and workshop tools. At the bottom, we have event management software and so on. And there's, at last count, from speaking to Steve Bather about this, he had over 400 separate collaboration tools. Now, the last thing you want is to have to go through all of those and figure out which is right for you. My preferred two, having looked at an awful lot of them, are Zoom on the one hand because of breakout rooms, because they're so easy. And secondly, Meeting Sphere for collaboration, because you can do some really excellent brainstorming, which gets divergent thinking going. And then voting and ranking, which gets convergent thinking going. And that's a really effective way of getting the best out of every board member. So that's a host of hugely different tools available. And so now all that remains is to see how can we pull all of those 4 stages together and pitch 10 important questions for you to take away and consider for your next board meeting. Back to you, David.
Thanks, Bob. So as you can see, Bob is trying to sort of present the challenge for any board going ahead. And our view would be that who wants to go back to physical board meetings? I think in future it's going to be a blended approach whenever that happens. Because you all sit on boards or report to boards. I think a question that I ask when I'm doing board evaluations, what's the cost of running this board? Do we know? And can we get an ROI in that board? Because you have, if there's fees paid or not, there's an opportunity cost and the whole cost of the executive and other costs that might be associated with the two. So I think in terms of going forward, I think organizations need to think about how can we run a really effective board program, probably blending virtual and physical in time. I think we're stuck with virtual for a while. And some of these tools here and some of these processes and some of these disciplines, I think will feed into that. So I think that's the challenge for anybody of the 120 people on this Zoom today, which is fantastic and we really appreciate. So we think there's 10 key questions that organizations need to consider.
David, just before you kick off on that, can I give 2 very simple practical examples of the cost issue that you've raised? And one is a local board that I was on, which when we had a subcommittee meeting in town, it took me typically an hour to travel from the suburbs, from Foxrock where I live, to get into the meeting. The subcommittee meeting was maybe an hour and a quarter, and then it took me another hour to get home, which was horrendously inefficient use of time, in my view. And the second board that I was on was based in Mexico City, and that's a non-trivial trip, and it's not in a car. The trip from either London or Paris or Madrid, which is one of the 3 options for crossing the Atlantic, was 12 hours itself just to get to Mexico City. So the travel time for a meeting was about 3 to 4 days, taking into account the before time, going there and coming back, and was really quite exhausting. So that's another very obvious cost in all of this. So let's have a look then at the 10 key questions, David, and we'll see if we get some reactions from people on these.
So think about that cost question and that efficiency and effectiveness. And I think some of these questions here will help you think about how you might go forward. So the first one, and we're going to remind you about some of the things we spoke about, is getting the meeting basics right. The board papers, timed agendas, clear focus on whether it's information or discussion or decision, and making sure the agenda is not too long. And if need be, have more board meetings. It's really easy in the virtual world to have another board meeting quite quickly because nobody has to travel. The second area would be just making sure the whole privacy, security, IT security is in place. Now, you know, people have had to go back to where they live quite quickly. Probably non-execs have technology, but to what extent has that been scrutinized to make sure that actually it's all okay and there's no fear of any leak, and that data, boardroom data that might be on your PC at home, how exposed that could that be? So things like Diligent or Decision Time or iBabs are platforms now that I think will accelerate the use of these tools to make sure that there's greater security for board papers.
And if I can chip in there, just David, on the security piece specifically, many of you on the call will know that we're currently conducting a cyber resilience survey for board members because of the increasing risks that these pose. And one of the key issues that we all have to be careful about as board members is the fact that, as the security guys would say, the attack surface has increased. In other words, the points of vulnerability that the bad guys can exploit if I'm on an old desktop machine at home, as opposed to the organization's issued PC that no one shares. And there's quite a lot of muddy water between the two. In some cases, organizations insist that only the organization's PCs can be used in Zoom calls or the equivalent. In other cases, a bring your own device approach is tolerated. And there are problems there which need to be looked at very, very carefully.
So other things to consider is making sure that all your board and indeed those reporting into the board and the company secretary are familiar with the technology. So going forward, if you're on a board, you're going to have to figure out what technology will we continue to use or change, and everything that goes around that, trying to orchestrate the best use of that technology, whether it's collaboration tools or polls or Zoom tools like this, that needs to be considered. Another thing that we spoke about, and Bob in particular here, is the use of collaboration tools to make sure that when you are around the boardroom table, you're making best use of that time. We all know that board committees are put in place to free up time for looking at the future in boardrooms. And, you know, there's lots of studies to say that at least half your time should be focused on the future. Probably a few boards at the moment are focused on survival, and that's fine. But actually, if you can use these tools to free up time around the boardroom table for more value-added discussion, that's the purpose of these tools. And also to be able to reach a conclusion, or at least narrowing down, you know, certain scenarios from maybe 5 to 2. So by the time you get to the boardroom table, you can talk about that.
And in our report, we have 2 use cases which describe how those collaboration tools proved really, really effective in getting common ground agreed before then having the virtual board meeting to discuss the areas which needed teasing out and discussion, and ultimately, you know, slightly amended approaches.
The next thing is making sure, which we've labored, is breaks, making sure that you get the appropriate number of breaks. And I think every hour for 10 minutes is not a bad thing to consider. In terms of ground rules, I mean, the chair working with the others need to establish what are they. You know, there's nothing more irritating if you're sitting in a boardroom. I was presenting a board evaluation there last year to a client, and this is before COVID came along, and somebody's dialing in 20 minutes late. There was no excuse to why they're dialing in 20 minutes late, and they left 10 minutes before the end. So that would be a ground rule you might want to consider. With Zoom, I think people actually are on time, because it's the right thing to do and it's easy to do. But just get the ground rules right from what the interactions might be, you know, what form the board papers need to be in. And in fact, I've come across some organizations now, because they went to virtual so quickly, their financial systems weren't actually equipped because the people weren't in the office to deliver the requisite, accurate, timely financial information that the organization needed. So that was not in place. And that's something that a finance committee might need to consider. You see that we've been using polls here. That's
just before you move on there, just to capitalize, there's an interesting question from Greg in the chat box asking, would it make sense for virtual board etiquette to be coached as part of director induction? And I think that's a super suggestion. In fact, ICSA, the Institute of Chartered Secretaries and Administrators, has an excellent guidance note on boardroom etiquette. And I've been surprised at the number of times that chairs have asked me to adapt, to fine tune that statement of etiquette, and to bring it in and not quite ram it down everyone's throat, but to remind people about the importance of proper etiquette, you know, not checking your phone, arriving on time, making sure you've read the papers and so on. So good suggestion there from Greg. Thank you for that.
I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to rattle on here a little bit.
Yeah.
The other thing was collaboration tools, which we spoke about, and I don't want to say too much more about those. The next area is the use of breakout rooms. I hope you all got into breakout room. I'm not sure. We were doing our best to make sure you did. But that, you know, that the technology is still evolving and isn't perfect. But breakout rooms, particularly virtual breakout rooms, are very helpful to get board members talking to each other when they might have met since the last one. And indeed, you might start off a board meeting by just having some breakout rooms to have a chat before starting the formal board meeting to get the best use of that collaboration. And the last one is to think about the tools you need to record ideas or record the minutes. I mean, I suspect a lot of organizations are using Zoom to record the meeting, they write the minutes, and then they delete the recording. But you need process and protocols around that. So we think if you got 7 out of 10 at this, you're doing quite well. There's quite a high bar here, I think we've set for people, but the purpose of this webinar is actually to, I suppose, demonstrate what's possible today. And I think, you know, going forward, I think every board should be kind of resetting how they want to run meetings to make them more effective and more efficient. So, quick poll, which of the 10 questions are the most valuable for you or your board? And we're going to run that now. Just pick one.
No, but pick as many, sorry, David, if I may.
Right.
You know, if you look at the 10 questions, which are the ones that you think would bring value to improving the effectiveness of your virtual board meetings? So just quickly run through and tick the ones that you think are of value, and we'll see what people say.
So you can see that myself and Bob have a collaboration improvement point there.
So these top 10 questions will be in the report, which will be circulating to everyone for ease of reference. Interesting to see that the ground rules question is one that's getting a lot of support at the moment. You know, a nice technique to introduce to meetings, I find, if you look at number 10 there, that's electronic meeting tools, but even a simple question at the end to ask everyone what one thing went well and what one thing could we do better at the next meeting, to make continuous improvement a feature or part of the DNA of the board, if you like, rather than it being once a year or once every 3 years when there's an external evaluation done. And that gets people thinking much more effectively about incorporating best practice on a meeting by meeting basis. Okay, David, I think we've got most people's votes there. We have about 84 people voted, so maybe just take another 20 seconds to finish off and we might have a few minutes for questions. Okay. Thank you, Anya.
Okay, so while you're just completing our polling, whoops. So what we brought to you together is the whole concept of user experience in the boardroom using technology. So I think we've presented many different variations and different ideas. There's lots of technology out there. So if you're in an organization with a board, that's probably a project that needs to be undertaken by the board over the next 2, 3, 4 months. The virtual meeting maturity model is probably the backdrop to this. You know, where are you today? Trying to assess where you are and where you want to get to. You don't need to travel the whole way along, but what's right for your organization? You know, there will be large organizations with great resources and there'll be small organizations with no resources. So you just need to be sensible. But technology can actually make board meetings so much more successful. And then we had your key questions to take away, and that will be in the report. So anybody who signed up to this should, by 2 o'clock today, get a copy of the report in their inbox. If you don't, please contact me. The slides and the recording will be on the governance company website within 24 hours. And they'll also be on our sister company, the Corporate Governance Institute, within 24 hours as well. Bob Semple is actually on the Governance Advisory Council of the Corporate Governance Institute, and I'm really indebted for him to helping us with this particular report here today. So we'll take any questions in the chat box or face to face. There seems to be a lot in the chat box at the moment. So Bob, I'll let you look at that.
Sure thing, sure thing. So an interesting point there on recording the meeting. One of the tools that I've experimented with recently is an AI system that takes a voice recording, converts it into text, and then seeks to do a summary of the meeting. Now, it's still in development stage, it has to be said. Watson is making a lot of progress in this area. For those of you familiar with the IBM supercomputer, Watson now does something called a sentiment analysis, so that it can actually analyze the text and the voice recording and give you a readout on the amount of anxiety, apprehension, joy, ambition, or otherwise, take all your different emotions. So lots of very interesting tools in that side of things. Terence has a point about hybrid meetings being a challenge, and I think you've nailed that one particularly, Terence. The hybrid is it's neither one nor t'other, but we're in a situation where we have some people in the room and then we have some people dialing in. And how do we make sure that that interaction works really, really well? So I think that's a space that people are experimenting with, and I suspect it may be something that we'll come back to in this session. No, I'm not having a virtual birthday party, Greg, but thanks for the thought anyway. The idea of the pulse polls after the board meeting, very, very effective. And as a technique I found as a chair, conducting a sounding can be a really helpful way of sensing where the debate is going on a particular topic. So I don't like, and most of us don't like, the formality of going straight to a vote, because that can be very divisive, especially if it's done too early and people feel they haven't had a chance to voice their concerns or their issues. But a sounding can be a very useful way to say, look, I'd like to get an indication from the board on an anonymous basis about the level of support for the proposal, where it stands at the moment. And it's not binding, and you can change your mind. And if you don't feel you can support it, well, then don't say that. And that'll give us an indication about how much more work we have to do in discussing the item. What else have we got here? Could it be that collaborative meetings before the board could lead to decisions being made by the collaborative group to hijack a topic? Great question. And I think that's one that has to be looked at very, very carefully, because you want to make sure that anonymity is used for getting all of the important issues out, but that it's not used in a mischievous or vexatious way. But good design will actually deal with that quite effectively. I'm scrolling back up. Are there any others that you spot there, David, you want to comment on?
Well, there's one individual here who says, I don't have AOB and agenda. I think one needs to think about that as a chair. Do you want AOB and agenda? Because there is the chance that if somebody lands an AOB item on agenda, it could be a hand grenade, and you don't know that. So I think one needs to be very careful about having it on the agenda, and if so, what criteria you're going to use to select AOB items for discussion.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think there's a balance on that one. I mean, obviously, and something when I'm looking at risk management, I often talk about emerging risks, you know, things that need to be called out because they've developed literally in the 2 days before the meeting. So there wasn't a chance to put them on a formal agenda item basis. But on the other hand, you don't want the hijack. So if there's a substantive issue which should have been notified in advance, then it's up to the chair using his rules, ground rules, whether you're using Robert's rules or any other standing orders approach, to be able to adjudicate on that. But of course, if the social trust is good, then you're not going to get ambushed like that.
Yeah.
So they're very, very interconnected.
Good question here from Fiona. Do we anticipate any legal issues with virtual meetings? I'm sure there will be. Just make sure your constitution covers virtual meetings, whether the committee meetings or board meetings. And I've no doubt they will emerge through security, you name it. And that's kind of new territory, I think. But I think if you do the basics right, you will reduce the risk, and perhaps actually on your risk register, should this be something you should consider?
Yeah, yeah. Conscious we're nearly at the 2 o'clock mark, David, so I don't know if you want to make some concluding remarks just to tie it up.
Well, thank you for coming out such numbers. We're delighted. I mean, 122 people from various countries. I want to thank Bob in particular, who put an enormous amount of effort into our survey and has added a vast amount to it. As I said, you should get this report in your inbox in 3 minutes. We hope the technology works, and it'll be on the Governance Company website in 24 hours, and also on our sister company, the Corporate Governance Institute, within 24 hours as well. So hopefully that's been helpful to everybody, and keep in contact, send us questions. We'd be delighted to try and address them if we can, but this is a bit of a journey, and hopefully this presentation and this thinking has helped you think through what your journey is for each individual organization. So thank you again, and thank you, Bob.
Thanks, David. Thanks, everyone.